But as he starts digging deeper into its mysterious origins, he discovers a shocking truth that brings tears streaming down his face. Sometimes the most valuable treasures aren't what they first appear to be. Farmer Michael stood frozen in place, his weathered hands trembling as he held the ornate brass key he'd just extracted from the mud-caked chest. The evening sun cast long shadows across his cornfield as he tried to process what he'd just discovered. Just hours ago, he'd been cursing his old tractor for breaking down mid-plow, forcing him to dig deeper into the soil by hand. Now, that frustrating moment seemed like divine intervention. The chest itself was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. Its dark wood covered in strange symbols and metalwork that seemed to shimmer despite years of being buried beneath his family's farmland. The intricate patterns carved into its surface appeared to tell a story, though Michael couldn't quite make sense of the elaborate designs. Some looked like ancient writing, while others resembled maps or celestial patterns. Despite being buried for what must have been decades, the chest's craftsmanship had endured, its mysterious allure untouched by time. As Michael brushed away more dirt from the lid, his fingers traced over what appeared to be a date, 1876. His heart skipped a beat. That was the year his great-great-grandfather had first settled this land. The coincidence seemed too perfect to ignore, but it was the small leather journal wedged beside the chest that made his pulse quicken even more. Its pages, though yellowed with age, were remarkably preserved, protected by a weathered leather cover that bore the same strange symbols as the chest. With trembling fingers, Michael carefully opened the journal to its first page. The handwriting was elegant, but hurried, as if the writer had been racing against time. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were still clearly legible. To whoever finds this chest, know that its contents hold not just material wealth, but a burden of truth that has weighed heavily upon my conscience. What lies within could change everything we know about this town's founding. Michael's eyes darted between the journal and the chest. The sun was setting faster now, casting an eerie glow across the freshly turned soil. He knew he should probably alert the authorities about his discovery. This could be a significant historical find. Yet something about the mysterious chest and its contents told him this might be exactly what he needed to save his failing farm. The property had been in his family for generations, but recent years had pushed him to the brink of bankruptcy. If there was even a chance this discovery could help him keep his land. As these thoughts raced through his mind, Michael noticed something else about the chest that made his blood run cold. Near its base, partially obscured by mud, was a warning etched in fading red ink. The truth comes with a price. Once opened, there's no turning back. The words sent a chill down his spine, but they also sparked his curiosity even more. What could be so significant that someone would go to such lengths to both preserve and warn about it? The rational part of his mind urged caution. In all his years of farming this land, he'd never found anything more exciting than old horseshoes and the occasional rusty farm tool. But this was different. The craftsmanship of the chest, the mysterious journal, the warning, it all pointed to something far more significant than a simple time capsule or buried keepsake. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the distant hills, Michael made his decision. He couldn't leave this here exposed to the elements and at risk of being discovered by someone else. With considerable effort, he managed to lift the chest, it was surprisingly heavy, and load it onto his pickup truck. The journal he tucked carefully into his jacket pocket, protecting it from the evening dew that had begun to settle over the fields. Before driving back to his farmhouse, Michael took one last look at the hole where he'd made his discovery. Something about this moment felt pivotal, as if he stood on the threshold between his old life and whatever secrets that chest might reveal. The warning on the chest echoed in his mind. Once opened, there's no turning back. As he drove home along the bumpy dirt road, the chest secured in his truck bed, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change dramatically. What he didn't know yet was just how right he was, and that the real mystery was far more incredible than anything he could have imagined. The chest rattled slightly with each bump in the road, its ancient wood creaking as if trying to speak. Michael glanced in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following him, but the road remained empty. Only the rising moon witnessed his journey home, its silver light catching the metalwork on the chest and making those strange symbols seem to dance in the darkness. The farmhouse Michael pulled up to was a shadow of its former glory. Paint peeled from its weathered siding, and several wooden steps creaked dangerously on the front porch. Just 30 years ago, when his father still ran things, this had been one of the most prosperous farms in Clayton County, Kentucky. Now, like so many family farms across America, it was barely hanging on. Michael sat in his truck for a moment, the chest and journal seeming to weigh heavier with each passing second. The pole light above the barn flickered weakly, illuminating the faded Henderson Family Farm. Established. 1876 sign his grandfather had proudly hung decades ago. The date matched the one on the chest exactly, making his discovery feel even more significant. Inside the farmhouse, bills were scattered across his kitchen table like fallen autumn leaves. The most recent one, printed in bold red letters, was a final notice from the bank. 6 months behind on his mortgage payments, they were threatening foreclosure if he couldn't come up with $75,000 by the end of the month. It might as well have been $1 million. His savings account had been empty for months, and no local bank would even consider giving him another loan. As Michael made coffee, his mind wandered to happier times. He remembered running through these same fields as a child, helping his father during harvest season, and learning every inch of the 200-acre property that had been in his family for 5 generations. His father, James Henderson, had been a pillar of the community, known not just for his award-winning corn crops, but for his generosity during hard times. Land is more than dirt, his father used to say. It's a legacy, a promise to those who came before and those who will come after. But things had changed drastically over the past decade. First came the drought of 2015, which decimated their corn crop and forced them to take out their first major loan. Then, his father's health began failing, and the medical bills started piling up. Cancer took James Henderson 2 years later, leaving Michael to handle both the farm and the mounting debt alone. He'd tried everything to keep the farm afloat. He'd sold off equipment they could barely afford to lose, rented out the north field to neighboring farmers, and even taken a part-time job at the local hardware store during off-seasons. But it never seemed to be enough. The big agricultural corporations kept driving prices down, making it nearly impossible for small family farms like his to compete. The coffee maker sputtered to life, filling the kitchen with its familiar aroma. Michael's eyes drifted to the family photos lining the walls. 5 generations of Hendersons, all working this same land. His great-great-grandfather William, stern-faced in a faded sepia photograph, had built this house with his own hands in 1876, the same year marked on that mysterious chest. Sarah, his wife of 15 years, had stuck by him through most of the hard times, but even she had her limits. Last spring, after another failed crop and mounting tensions, she'd taken a teaching job in Cincinnati. Just temporary, she'd said, until things get better. They both knew better. The divorce papers had arrived last month, yet another bill he couldn't afford to pay. Running his fingers through his graying hair, Michael glanced out the window toward his truck where the chest sat waiting. At 45, he felt twice his age, worn down by years of struggle and disappointment. The farm that had once been his family's pride had become a crushing burden, each day bringing new challenges and fewer solutions. The local farming community had changed too. Where once there had been dozens of family farms, now there were only a handful left. Most had sold out to big corporations or developers eager to turn fertile farmland into suburban housing developments. Michael had received those offers too, increasingly generous ones as his financial situation became common knowledge. But something in him refused to be the Henderson who gave up on 5 generations of history. His coffee had grown cold, forgotten as he stared at the stack of unpaid bills. The bank's deadline loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. Without a miracle, he'd lose everything his family had built. The thought of his father's disappointed face haunted him more than the threatening letters from the bank's lawyers. The old grandfather clock in the hallway, another family heirloom, struck 9 with a hollow chime that echoed through the empty house. Its sound seemed to wake Michael from his brooding. He stood up. decision made. Whatever was in that chest, be it valuable artifacts or worthless junk, he had to know. He couldn't wait until morning. Grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and his coffee, now cold but still needed, Michael headed out to his truck. The night had grown cooler, and a slight breeze carried the sweet scent of corn from his fields. As he approached the truck, the chest's metalwork caught the moonlight again, those strange symbols seeming to writhe in the darkness. "Please," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was praying or just talking to himself. "Let this be something that can help save my farm." Little did he know, as he prepared to move the chest into his barn for closer inspection, that its contents would indeed change everything, though not in any way he could have possibly imagined. Michael's hands shook as he carefully carried the chest into his barn, setting it down on his old workbench beneath the flickering fluorescent light. The leather journal he'd found with it lay beside the chest, its pages seeming to whisper secrets in the quiet of the night. For several long moments, he simply stared at both items, gathering his courage. The brass key felt heavy in his pocket, like it carried the weight of history itself. As he pulled it out, the metal caught the light, revealing more of those peculiar symbols etched into its surface. They matched the ones on the chest perfectly. Taking a deep breath, Michael aligned the key with the lock. It slid in smoothly, as if it had been waiting all these years for this exact moment. The mechanism clicked with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silent barn. Michael hesitated, the warning inscription flashing through his mind. The truth comes with a price. Once opened, there's no turning back. His father had always taught him that anything worth having came with responsibility. Whatever lay inside this chest, he knew this moment would change everything. With a slow, deliberate motion, he turned the key. The lock released with a soft click that seemed to echo through time itself. Before lifting the lid, Michael decided to examine the journal first. Maybe it would give him some clue about what to expect. The leather cover was warm to the touch, despite the cool night air. Opening it carefully, he began to read. April 15th, 1876. To whoever finds this chest and journal, I, William Henderson, write these words with a heavy heart. What we discovered while founding this town must be protected, yet cannot be destroyed. The artifacts within this chest tell a truth so profound it could reshape our understanding of this land's history. Michael's breath caught in his throat. William Henderson, his great-great-grandfather, the very man who'd established this farm. The connection was undeniable now, but it only deepened the mystery. As he read on, the journal spoke of a discovery made while clearing the land for farming, something that the town's founding families had agreed to keep secret. His hands trembling even more now, Michael turned back to the chest. The moment he lifted the lid, a musty, ancient smell filled the air. Inside, carefully wrapped in deteriorating cloth, lay several objects that made his heart race. A collection of strange metallic artifacts, their surfaces covered in the same mysterious symbols as the chest. What appeared to be maps drawn on aged parchment. And at the bottom, something that made him gasp. A small box made of a material he'd never seen before, seeming to shimmer with an inner light despite its age. But it was the small leather pouch tucked into one corner that first caught his attention. As he carefully opened it, several gold coins spilled out onto his workbench. Even in the dim barn light, he could tell they were old, very old. His heart began to race. Just one of these coins, if authentic, could be worth thousands. Then his eyes fell on a folded paper tucked into the pouch. Unfolding it with trembling fingers, he found himself looking at what appeared to be a map of his own land, but with markings and notes he'd never seen before. X's marked several locations across the property, with one circled repeatedly near the old North Creek. The implications slowly sank in. If this map was accurate, if there were more treasures buried across his land, this could be the solution to all his problems, the means to save his farm, to preserve his family's legacy. But as he read more of the journal entries, his excitement began to mix with unease. His great-great-grandfather's words grew increasingly cryptic, hinting at something far more significant than mere buried treasure. The artifacts we found challenge everything we believe, one entry read. They point to a history that some would rather keep buried. I fear what might happen if this knowledge falls into the wrong hands. Yet I cannot bring myself to destroy the evidence. Perhaps in time, the right person will find this chest and know what to do with its contents. Michael sat back, his mind racing. He had a choice to make. He could take the gold coins, sell them quietly, and potentially save his farm. That alone would be enough to change his life. But the journal and artifacts hinted at something bigger, a mystery that had been waiting 5 generations to be solved. The responsible thing would be to call the Historical Society, maybe even the university. Let experts examine everything properly. But then he'd lose control of the situation. His land would likely be swarmed with archaeologists, his privacy invaded, and any chance of using this discovery to save his farm would vanish. As he wrestled with his decision, the wind picked up outside, rattling the barn doors. The sound startled him, making him feel suddenly exposed. How long before someone else discovered what he'd found? How long could he keep this secret while deciding what to do? Over the next week, Michael's life fell into a new rhythm, one dictated by his secret discovery. Each night, after ensuring no one was around, he would lock himself in the barn with the chest and its mysterious contents. The gold coins he'd carefully hidden in his gun safe, but it was the other artifacts that increasingly consumed his attention. The strange metallic objects defied explanation. Each one seemed to be part of something larger, with grooves and connections that suggested they could somehow fit together. The symbols covering their surfaces reminded him of circuit boards, yet these pieces were supposedly from the 1800s. The material itself was puzzling, lighter than aluminum, but stronger than steel, and with that odd shimmer that seemed to catch light from angles that shouldn't be possible. During the days, Michael maintained his regular farm duties, though his mind constantly wandered to the mysteries in his barn. He'd started marking the locations from the old map onto his modern GPS system, creating a detailed survey of where other artifacts might be buried. The first X on the map was near the North Creek, and he'd begun carefully investigating the area whenever he could spare time. One particularly revealing entry in his great-great-grandfather's journal kept drawing him back. June 3, 1876. Today we uncovered more pieces near the creek. Thomas believes they're parts of a machine, though like none we've ever seen. The symbols match those found on the first discovery, but their purpose remains elusive. Jenkins wanted to take them to Boston for study, but the vote was unanimous. Whatever this is must stay hidden. The implications of such advanced craftsmanship, existing here, long before our settlement. Some truths are better left buried until the world is ready. Michael had started cataloging everything methodically, photographing each artifact and transcribing the journal entries into his laptop. The more he studied, the more convinced he became that he'd stumbled onto something extraordinary. The gold coins alone could save his farm. He'd carefully researched similar specimens online and estimated they could be worth upwards of $100,000. But the other artifacts, they hinted at a discovery that could be worth far more than mere money. His neighbors had started to notice changes in his behavior. Old Tom Fletcher, whose property bordered his to the south, commented that he'd seen lights in Michael's barn at odd hours. Sarah, his soon-to-be ex-wife, called to check on him after hearing from mutual friends that he seemed distracted lately. He'd brushed off their concerns with vague explanations about working late on equipment repairs. The isolation was starting to wear on him, though. The weight of the secret, combined with his growing excitement about what he might have discovered, made him desperate to share it with someone. But who could he trust? The journal's warnings about keeping the discovery hidden had seemed paranoid at first, but the more he understood about what he'd found, the more those warnings made sense. One night, about 10 days after his initial discovery, Michael made a breakthrough. He'd been examining one of the metallic artifacts under his work light when he noticed that the symbols changed appearance when viewed from different angles. Grabbing his phone, he started taking photos from various positions. When he reviewed the images, his hands started shaking. The symbols appeared to shift between photos, forming different patterns depending on the viewing angle. This wasn't just ancient writing. It was something far more sophisticated. The technology required to create such an effect wouldn't be invented for another century after these artifacts were supposedly buried, which meant either his great-great-grandfather's dating was wrong, or the alternative made his head spin. That same night, he began digging at the first X marked on the map near the North Creek. The summer night was humid, and sweat soaked through his shirt as he carefully excavated the area. 3 feet down, his shovel struck something solid. Using smaller tools, he gradually exposed what appeared to be another chest, smaller than the first, but made of the same strange metal-like material. Before he could extract it, headlights swept across his property. A car was coming down his long driveway. Quickly covering his excavation with a tarp and some loose brush, Michael hurried back to his house, heart pounding. It turned out to be just a lost driver looking for directions, but the close call left him shaken. He was getting closer to something big. He could feel it. But with each new discovery, the pressure mounted. The bank's deadline was still looming, yet now he hesitated to sell even a single gold coin. What if they were part of a larger puzzle? What if his great-great-grandfather had hidden them with the artifacts for a specific reason? Sleep became a luxury, as Michael spent his nights studying the journal and artifacts, and his days maintaining a facade of normalcy. The circles under his eyes grew darker, but so did his determination to uncover the truth. He knew he was becoming obsessed, but he couldn't stop. Not when he might be on the verge of discovering something that could change not just his life, but potentially much more. As the summer heat intensified, so did Michael's doubts and fears. 3 weeks had passed since his initial discovery, and the mysteries were only deepening. The second chest he'd unearthed near the creek contained more of the inexplicable artifacts, but these were different. They appeared to be power sources of some kind, with interior components visible through translucent sections that occasionally pulsed with a faint, greenish glow. Late one night, as he examined these new pieces under his worklight, the first seed of real fear took root. What if these objects were dangerous? Some of the journal entries had started to take on a more ominous tone. August 15th, 1876. Jenkins' boy took ill today after handling one of the devices. The fever broke by nightfall, but the incident has rattled us all. We've sealed the more active pieces in lead-lined boxes. I fear we may be dealing with forces beyond our understanding. Yet destroying them seems impossible. The materials resist all attempts at damage. What manner of craftsman could create such indestructible works? Michael found himself obsessively checking his own health, paranoid about radiation or other unknown effects from handling the artifacts. He'd started wearing gloves and even purchased a Geiger counter from an online supplier, though its readings showed nothing unusual. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was playing with fire. The financial pressure wasn't helping his state of mind. The bank's deadline was now just a week away, and he'd begun receiving daily calls from their collections department. The gold coins sat untouched in his safe, their potential salvation taunting him. Every time he resolved to sell just one, another journal entry or artifact discovery would give him pause. His behavior was becoming increasingly erratic. He'd installed new locks on the barn and set up security cameras around his property. The paranoia had started affecting his sleep. When he managed to rest at all, his dreams were filled with shifting symbols and mysterious lights. More than once he'd jolted awake convinced he'd seen strange figures moving across his fields at night. Sarah's concerned calls became more frequent. During their last conversation, she'd mentioned coming to visit, worried about his rambling explanations and distracted manner. The thought of anyone discovering his secret sent him into a panic. He'd made excuses about being too busy with harvest preparations, but he could tell she wasn't convinced. One particularly hot afternoon, as Michael was transcribing more journal entries, he came across a passage that made his blood run cold. September 3rd, 1876. The men voted today. All evidence of our discovery must be scattered and buried across the property, no single person knowing all locations. Too many strange accidents have occurred. Too many unexplained lights in the night sky. We're being watched, of that I'm certain now. Better this knowledge remain hidden than fall into the wrong hands. I pray my descendants understand the burden I place upon them with this secret." The mention of lights in the sky triggered a memory. 3 nights ago, he'd spotted an unusual aircraft hovering silently over his northern field. He'd dismissed it as exhaustion, playing tricks on his mind. But now, what if someone else knew about the artifacts? What if they were searching for them? His research into the symbols had led him down increasingly bizarre paths. Late-night internet searches suggested similarities to ancient astronomical charts, but with impossible variations. The configurations mapped star systems that shouldn't have been discoverable in the 1800s. Some symbols seemed to reference mathematical concepts that wouldn't be theorized for another century. The implications were staggering, but they also terrified him. If his suspicions about the artifact's true nature were correct, he was sitting on the most significant historical discovery of the century. But that same realization made him feel incredibly vulnerable. How long before others figured it out? How long before they came for what he'd found? The farm's isolation, once peaceful, now felt threatening. Every distant car engine might be government agents or mysterious organizations coming to seize his discovery. Every unexpected phone call could be someone who had somehow learned his secret. He'd started keeping the artifacts in different locations, moving them regularly, paranoid about having them all in one place. Even the weather seemed to be conspiring against him. A series of unusual storms had swept through the area, bringing with them strange electrical disturbances. Twice now, he'd observed his compass spinning wildly when placed near certain artifacts. His cell phone frequently lost signal in the barn, and his security cameras occasionally captured unexplainable static. The final straw came when he received an unmarked envelope in his mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing the same symbols he'd been studying. No return address, no explanation. Was it a warning? A threat? A sign that he was on the right track? He couldn't be sure, and the uncertainty was eating away at him. That night, as he sat in his barn surrounded by his discoveries, Michael faced a harsh reality. He was in over his head. The weight of this secret was crushing him, the responsibility too great for one person to bear. But who could he trust? The authorities? Academic researchers? His family? Each option seemed to carry its own dangers. As if to punctuate his doubts, a low humming sound filled the air, accompanied by a subtle vibration from the artifacts. The symbols began to glow faintly, responding to something he couldn't understand. Michael backed away, his heart racing. What had his great-great-grandfather discovered? More importantly, what had he unleashed by digging it all up? The crisis began on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 month after Michael's initial discovery. The bank's final deadline loomed just 3 days away, but that would soon become the least of his concerns. It started with the headaches. At first, Michael attributed them to stress and lack of sleep, but they quickly intensified into debilitating migraines that left him seeing strange patterns at the edges of his vision. These patterns eerily resembled the symbols from the artifacts, seeming to float in the air around him like ghostly hieroglyphics. That same afternoon, while examining one of the artifacts in his barn, Michael noticed his hands were shaking uncontrollably. The tremors spread up his arms, accompanied by a burning sensation that felt like electricity coursing through his veins. Panic set in as he remembered Jenkins's boy from the journal entries, the mysterious illness that had struck after handling the artifacts. Stumbling out of the barn, Michael barely made it to his house before collapsing on the kitchen floor. His skin felt like it was on fire, and the mysterious symbols now filled his entire field of vision, pulsing in rhythm with his racing heartbeat. Through the haze of pain, he managed to reach his phone and dial 911. But when the dispatcher answered, he found himself unable to speak. The words wouldn't come. Instead, strange sounds emerged from his throat, guttural utterances that seemed to mirror the rhythmic patterns of the artifact's symbols. The last thing he remembered before losing consciousness was a blinding light flooding through his kitchen windows, accompanied by that now familiar humming sound that seemed to resonate with something deep inside his bones. He awoke 3 days later in the county hospital, surrounded by beeping monitors and concerned faces. Sarah was there, having driven down from Cincinnati after the hospital contacted her as his emergency contact. The doctors were baffled. His symptoms defied conventional diagnosis: extreme fever, neurological disturbances, and most peculiarly, traces of unknown elements in his bloodstream that their equipment couldn't identify. But worse than the physical symptoms was the revelation that came during his period of unconsciousness. While he lay in the hospital, a severe storm had swept through his property. Lightning had struck his barn multiple times, far too many times to be natural, reducing the structure to charred ruins. The chest, the artifacts, the journal, everything he'd discovered was now gone, destroyed in the inexplicable blaze. Or so he thought. When the police investigated the fire, they found something odd. Despite the intensity of the blaze, which had melted steel beams, there was no trace of the artifacts or the chest. No melted metal, no burnt leather, no ashes from the journal's pages. It was as if they had never existed at all. The bank seized this moment of crisis to make their move. With Michael hospitalized and unable to make his payment deadline, foreclosure proceedings began immediately. Sarah, trying to help, had gone through his recent financial records looking for any way to save the farm. She discovered his increasingly erratic spending, the security equipment, the Geiger counter, dozens of books on ancient civilizations and astronomical anomalies. Combined with his delirious ramblings about mysterious artifacts and family secrets, it painted a picture that concerned everyone. His doctors recommended psychiatric evaluation, suggesting that the stress of potentially losing his farm had triggered a mental breakdown. They pointed to his symptoms, the hallucinations, the incomprehensible speaking, the elaborate story about discovering mysterious artifacts, as clear signs of a psychotic episode. Even the evidence that might have proved his story had vanished. The photos he'd taken of the artifacts were gone from his phone, replaced by corrupted files that showed only static. His detailed notes and transcriptions of the journal had disappeared from his laptop, which had been fried by the same power surge that had affected his entire property during the storm. The final blow came when he convinced Sarah to check his gun safe for the gold coins. They were gone, replaced by ordinary metal slugs that looked like they'd been aged to appear ancient. Had they always been fake? Had someone switched them? Or was he truly losing his mind? Lying in his hospital bed, Michael felt the full weight of his isolation. Nobody believed him. How could they? He had no proof, no evidence, nothing to support his incredible story. Even he was beginning to doubt his own memories. Had he imagined it all? Were the doctors right about him having a breakdown? But then there were the blood tests, showing those inexplicable elements, and the strange patterns of the lightning strikes on his barn, which the weather service couldn't explain. And most convincingly, the small mark on his forearm, a pattern of raised skin that perfectly matched one of the symbols he remembered from the artifacts. The hospital planned to transfer him to their psychiatric ward for observation once his physical symptoms stabilized. Sarah, though skeptical of his story, had at least convinced them to let her take him to a private facility in Cincinnati instead. She blamed herself for not seeing the signs of his deteriorating mental state sooner, for letting the pressure of losing the farm push him over the edge. As Michael lay there, watching another unexplainable light show dance across the night sky through his hospital window, he faced the most difficult question of all. What if everyone was right? What if there was no mystery, no artifacts, no family secret? What if his mind, unable to cope with losing his family's legacy, had constructed an elaborate fantasy to give meaning to his failure? But then, why did those lights in the sky seem to pulse in perfect synchronization with the symbol burned into his arm? As Michael faced the darkest period of his life, help arrived from an unexpected source. Old Tom Fletcher, his neighbor for over 20 years, wasn't the type to believe in conspiracies or supernatural occurrences. But he was the type to stand by a neighbor in trouble, regardless of the circumstances. On the day Michael was scheduled to be transferred to the Cincinnati facility, Tom appeared in his hospital room, clutching a worn manila envelope. The older farmer's weathered face was etched with concern, but also determination. "Before they take you away, son, there's something you need to see," Tom said, his voice gravelly with age and emotion. He pulled several photographs from the envelope, laying them carefully on Michael's hospital bed. They were old Polaroids, their edges yellowed with time, dating back to 1976, exactly 100 years after the original discovery. The photos showed Tom's father standing next to what appeared to be excavated pieces of metal, covered in familiar symbols that made Michael's heart race. But it was the final photo that truly caught his attention, a clear shot of the night sky over their farmland, showing unusual lights arranged in a pattern that matched the symbol now permanently marked on Michael's arm. "My father found similar things on our property," Tom explained quietly. "Drove himself half crazy trying to figure out what they were. The night he took that last photo, everything disappeared, just vanished, like it had never been there. He never spoke of it again, but he kept these photos hidden away with a note saying they should only be shared if history repeated itself." This revelation changed everything. Michael wasn't crazy, and more importantly, he wasn't alone. Tom had already spoken with Sarah, sharing his family's story and the photos as evidence. Though still skeptical, she began to question the psychiatric diagnosis. If similar events had happened before, documented by a respected member of the community, perhaps there was more to Michael's story than mental illness. Word spread quickly through the farming community. Other longtime residents came forward with their own strange tales, unexplained lights, mysterious findings while plowing fields, and odd occurrences that seemed to follow a 100-year cycle. The pattern was undeniable. The local historical society, led by librarian Martha Jenkins, a descendant of the same Jenkins mentioned in the original journal, began piecing together similar accounts from the area's past. They discovered that every 100 years, like clockwork, similar events had occurred. Objects would be found, lights would appear, and then everything would vanish, leaving those involved questioning their sanity. Support came in other forms, too. When the bank moved to auction off Michael's farm, the community rallied. Local farmers pooled their resources, and with Tom Fletcher leading the effort, they managed to secure a 6-month extension on Michael's loan. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it bought precious time. Sarah, moved by the community's support and the mounting evidence supporting Michael's story, postponed the transfer to Cincinnati. Instead, she took a leave of absence from her teaching job and moved back to the farm temporarily. Though their relationship remained complicated, she was determined to help uncover the truth. The physical evidence of Michael's discovery might have vanished, but the mark on his arm remained, along with the unexplainable elements in his blood. Dr. Emily Chen, a research scientist from the state university who had family in the area, took an interest in his case. She began documenting the medical anomalies, drawing parallels to similar cases throughout history. As Michael recovered his strength, the community maintained a protective circle around him. Neighbors took turns helping with farm work, ensuring his property remained active and maintained. Local kids, fascinated by the mystery, volunteered to help search his land for any remaining clues, though Michael warned them not to touch anything unusual they might find. Tom Fletcher spent long evenings with Michael, sharing everything he remembered from his father's experience. The similarities were striking: the initial discovery, the mysterious illness, the destructive storm, the vanishing evidence. But Tom's father had faced it alone, eventually taking his secret to the grave. Thanks to the community's support, Michael's experience was different. Yet questions remained. Why every 100 years? What connected the Henderson and Fletcher farms? And most importantly, would the pattern repeat? Or had Michael's discovery somehow broken the cycle? The symbol on his arm seemed to pulse with renewed energy whenever these questions arose, as if responding to his thoughts. And on clear nights, the lights still danced above his property, visible now to everyone who cared to look up. The community's acknowledgement of these phenomena helped anchor Michael in reality, preventing him from slipping back into the doubt and paranoia that had nearly destroyed him. "My father always said some mysteries aren't meant to be solved," Tom told him one evening, as they watched the lights perform their nightly dance. "Maybe they're just meant to be witnessed and shared, so we remember we're part of something bigger than ourselves." The breakthrough came on a crisp autumn morning, exactly 100 days after Michael's initial discovery. Dr. Chen had brought specialized equipment to analyze the mark on his arm, equipment that revealed something extraordinary. Under ultraviolet light, the symbol didn't just glow, it projected a complex series of patterns into the air above it, creating what appeared to be a three-dimensional map. Sarah, who had been documenting everything with her teacher's methodical precision, was the first to recognize the significance. The projected pattern perfectly matched the arrangement of both properties, the Henderson and Fletcher farms, as they had existed in 1876. But it showed something more, a network of lines connecting various points across both properties, forming a perfect geometric pattern that couldn't be natural. "It's like a circuit board," Dr. Chen explained, her eyes wide with excitement as she studied the projection. "But it's using the land itself as the conducting material. The symbols we've been finding, they're not just writing or decorative patterns. They're coordinates, components of a larger system." This revelation led to another discovery. Using ground-penetrating radar borrowed from the university, they began mapping the exact points indicated by the projection. At each intersection of the geometric lines, they found traces of the same unusual elements that had shown up in Michael's bloodwork. The Earth itself seemed to pulse with energy at these points, causing their equipment to behave erratically. But the most significant breakthrough came when Martha Jenkins uncovered something in the Historical Society's archives, a series of land surveys dating back to the original settlement of the area. The surveys showed that both the Henderson and Fletcher properties had once been part of a larger piece of land, one that had belonged to an indigenous tribe long before European settlers arrived. According to tribal records Martha managed to access, the land had been considered sacred ground, a place where the Star People would communicate with the tribe's ancestors. The tribe's descriptions of these interactions matched with uncanny accuracy the phenomena both Michael and Tom's father had experienced. "They're not just random artifacts we've been finding," Martha explained, spreading the ancient maps across Michael's kitchen table. "They're pieces of something much older, something that was here long before our families arrived. Our ancestors didn't discover these objects, they rediscovered them." The symbol on Michael's arm seemed to respond to this revelation, its pulsing growing stronger. Dr. Chen's instruments recorded an uptick in unusual energy readings across the entire property. The lights in the night sky became more frequent, more organized, as if acknowledging that humans were finally beginning to understand. Sarah, who had remained skeptical despite supporting Michael, found herself unable to deny the mounting evidence. Her scientific mind struggled to reconcile what they were discovering with her understanding of reality. "Whatever this is," she said one evening, "it's been trying to communicate with us for generations. We just weren't ready to understand the message." The breakthrough brought international attention. Despite the community's efforts to keep things quiet, word began to spread. UFO enthusiasts and conspiracy theorists started appearing at the edge of Michael's property, hoping to catch a glimpse of the lights. But it was the arrival of Dr. James Liu, a quantum physicist from MIT, that truly changed the game. Dr. Liu had been studying similar phenomena around the world, places where ancient sites aligned with unexplainable energy patterns. After examining the data from Michael's property, he proposed a theory that was both terrifying and exhilarating. "These sites aren't random," he explained to the small group gathered in Michael's living room. "They're nodes in a vast network, a communication system that predates human civilization. The 100-year cycle? It's not a mystery. It's a maintenance schedule. Something or someone has been checking on these nodes, ensuring they remain functional." The mark on Michael's arm, Dr. Liu suggested, wasn't a warning or a brand. It was an access key. His illness hadn't been a random reaction to handling the artifacts. It had been part of a process, an initialization of sorts. The burning of the barn, the disappearance of the artifacts, all part of a protocol they were only beginning to understand. "The question isn't what happened to the artifacts," Dr. Liu said, his voice filled with wonder. "The question is, what happens next? Because for the first time in recorded history, someone has been marked as a recognized user of the system. The cycle has been broken." As if in response to his words, the lights above the farm shifted, forming new patterns. The symbol on Michael's arm burned with renewed intensity. And somewhere deep beneath the earth, something that had waited centuries to be understood began to awaken. The true value of Michael's discovery revealed itself not in gold coins or ancient artifacts, but in something far more profound. On a moonless night in late October, as the assembled team of scientists continued their research, everything changed. Michael had been standing in his north field with Dr. Liu and Sarah, discussing the latest energy readings, when the symbol on his arm began to burn with an intensity he'd never experienced before. The pain wasn't uncomfortable, though. It felt more like recognition, like a key finding its lock. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet trembled. Not violently, but with a deliberate rhythm that matched the pulsing of Michael's mark. Dr. Liu's instruments went haywire, their readings shooting off the charts. Sarah grabbed her camera, documenting everything as streams of light began emerging from the earth at each of the mapped intersection points. "It's activating," Dr. Liu whispered, his voice filled with awe. "The entire network. It's powering up." The lights rose higher, forming connecting lines of energy that perfectly matched the geometric pattern they'd discovered. It was as if the map projected from Michael's arm had come to life, painting the night sky with rivers of light. But this was just the beginning. At the center of the pattern, directly where Michael stood, the air itself seemed to fold. There was no other way to describe it. Reality rippled like a curtain in the wind, and through that ripple stepped a figure that defied explanation. It was humanoid, but composed of shifting light and geometric patterns that echoed the symbols they'd been studying. When it spoke, the words formed directly in their minds, accompanied by images and emotions that made verbal language seem primitive by comparison. "The initialization is complete," the being communicated. "After 50,000 cycles, we have finally achieved successful integration." Through the telepathic connection, Michael and the others understood the truth. The artifacts, the 100-year cycles, the mysterious illnesses, they had all been tests, parts of an ancient protocol established long before human civilization emerged. Earth was part of a vast network of connected worlds, linked by technology so advanced it appeared magical to human understanding. "Your ancestors," the being explained, "were not ready. Each cycle, we tested for compatibility, hoping to find minds capable of comprehending our existence without fracturing. Until now, the results were disappointing. Images flooded their minds, previous discoveries throughout history, the panic and fear that followed, the necessary memory wipes and removals of evidence. But this time was different. This time, humanity had approached the discovery with curiosity instead of fear, with a desire to understand rather than control." The being turned to Michael, its form shimming with what felt like approval. "Your mark is not just a symbol, it is an acceptance into the network. Your species has demonstrated the capacity for collective understanding. Through you, we can begin the process of integration." Dr. Liu's instruments, still running, were capturing readings that would revolutionize human understanding of physics. Sarah's camera recorded evidence that would forever change humanity's view of its place in the universe. But it was the next revelation that truly demonstrated the value of what they'd discovered. The being raised what might have been an arm, and the air rippled again. This time, a series of images appeared, showing countless worlds, all connected by the same network they'd uncovered. These weren't just communication nodes. They were gateways, paths to civilizations that had been waiting to welcome humanity into a larger community. "Your world stands at a crucial threshold," the being explained. "The challenges you face, environmental degradation, resource depletion, social division, we have seen them all before. We offer not solutions, but connections. The opportunity to learn from those who have faced similar challenges and survived." Michael understood then why his family's land had been chosen, why generations of farmers had been entrusted with protecting this secret until humanity was ready. The same connection to the earth that had allowed them to nurture crops had made them ideal guardians of this greater trust. The financial troubles that had seemed so overwhelming now appeared trivial. His farm wasn't just a piece of land to be saved. It was a gateway to humanity's next great adventure. The being confirmed this understanding, sharing images of how the property would become a center for cultural and scientific exchange, a place where human researchers could begin the long process of preparing Earth for official connection to the network. Sarah, tears streaming down her face, reached for Michael's hand. The gesture wasn't lost on their visitor. The capacity for emotional connection while maintaining intellectual curiosity. This is why your time has come. Previous cycles ended in fear or greed. You have shown us something different. Dr. Liu, normally so analytical, found himself overwhelmed by the implications. His life's work studying quantum connections between distant points in space hadn't been theoretical after all. He'd been documenting fragments of this vast network without realizing it. 1 year later, Michael stood on his front porch, looking out over a landscape transformed not just physically, but in its very purpose. His farm, once on the brink of foreclosure, had become humanity's first official contact point with the interstellar network. The old barn had been replaced by a sleek research facility, its design a harmonious blend of human and alien architecture, yet still somehow fitting perfectly into the rural Kentucky landscape. The symbol on his arm had become more than a mark. It was now a badge of office. As Earth's first recognized network guardian, Michael found himself at the center of humanity's greatest adventure. But true to his farming roots, he'd insisted on maintaining much of the agricultural activity alongside the scientific research. The best way to understand other worlds, he often said, is to stay connected to our own. Sarah had returned permanently, their relationship renewed by shared purpose rather than obligation. She now headed the educational outreach program, helping people understand and adapt to Earth's new reality. Her classroom experience proved invaluable in making complex concepts accessible to the public. The lights in the night sky had become a regular occurrence, no longer a source of fear, but a reminder of humanity's growing connection to a larger community. Each pulse of energy brought new knowledge, new opportunities, new understanding of humanity's place in the vast network of civilizations. The Fletcher farm, too, had been incorporated into the project. Old Tom's daily visits to the research facility, sharing stories with scientists from around the world, became legendary. His father's photographs, once hidden away in fear, now held a place of honor in the facility's museum alongside other artifacts of humanity's long journey toward this moment. Dr. Liu's research had revolutionized human science, but it was his humble acknowledgement of how much they still had to learn that most impressed their interstellar visitors. The being who had first emerged from the portal became a regular presence, its shifting form now a familiar sight across the property, as it helped guide humanity's integration into the network. But perhaps the most profound change was in the local community's response. Instead of fear or resistance, they had embraced their role as custodians of this remarkable gift. Farmers from neighboring properties proudly maintained their traditional work alongside the advanced research facilities, demonstrating to visiting beings that progress didn't require abandoning one's roots. On this particular evening, as the sun set over his fields, Michael watched a group of local children playing with young beings from 3 different worlds in his old cornfield. Their laughter needed no translation, their joy transcending the vast distances between their homeworlds. The journal of his great-great-grandfather, William Henderson, had reappeared one day, materializing on Michael's kitchen table. Its final pages now contained new entries, written in the same hand that had recorded the original discovery. To all who follow, know that your guardianship was not a burden, but a gift. Each generation played its part, keeping safe what they did not understand, until the right moment arrived. In your hands now rests not just our family's legacy, but humanity's future among the stars. The being appeared beside Michael, its form shimmering in the dying light. Your world adapts well, it communicated. Others have taken centuries to adjust to network integration. Your people embrace it while maintaining your essential nature. This is why you were chosen. Michael smiled, watching another portal shimmer into existence in the distance, bringing new visitors to Earth. The financial worries that had once kept him awake at night seemed like a lifetime ago. His farm had indeed been saved, but in a way he could never have imagined. "Sometimes," he replied, touching the symbol on his arm, "the most valuable treasures aren't what they first appear to be." The being's form pulsed in what Michael had come to recognize as amusement. "Indeed," it agreed. "Though I believe your great-great-grandfather suspected as much, even then." As night fell over the Henderson farm, the lights above danced in celebration, marking not an ending, but a beginning. Humanity had taken its first steps into a larger universe, guided by the most unlikely of ambassadors, a farmer who had never lost his connection to the land that had hidden such extraordinary secrets for so long. In the end, Michael realized, it had never been about saving his farm. It had been about preserving something far more precious: hope. Hope for a future where humanity could reach for the stars while keeping its feet firmly planted in the soil that had nurtured generations of dreamers and guardians. And somewhere, in the vast network of worlds now open to humanity, new adventures waited to begin.